What would you do when the whole world doesn't see and understands the way you do? Welcome back to Classic Movie Recap. Today we will be summarizing a movie based on the movie Jobs, 2013. It is 2001. Steve Jobs walks into a stage introducing the revolutionary iPod, which was a big thing back then. The first pocket-size MP3 with a storage capacity of up to 100,000 songs. Everyone was on their feet cheering Steve for the announcement. The movie then flashes back to the year 1974. Steve had dropped out from Reed College due to overpriced tuition fees. He also thinks that a college degree is a waste of time. However, Dean Jack Dudman sees potential in Steve. He wants him to stay in college and take classes, but was ignored by Steve. Steve then meets a girl named Julie. Not only Steve fell in love with Julie, he also fell in love with art. To be more specific, calligraphy. Over the years, Steve went to a variety of classes and even took meditation classes. It is the year 1976. After college, Steve moved back to live with his parents and worked at Atari, a once well-known game developer company. Steve does not work well with his colleagues. Steve always believes that things must be improved differently. Since Steve does not work well with others, he got an opportunity to work on his own project to develop a game. It was late at night. Steve was struggling to develop the game. He got frustrated because the deadline he promised was coming near. Steve had no choice but to call his best friend Steve Wozniak for help. Woz, as a good friend, came in to help him. The next day, Steve's boss was very impressed with his work. He enjoyed the game and can't stop playing it. One day, Steve visited Woz in his home. Suddenly, something caught into his eyes. A computer that has a synchronized display through a television. It was a big deal back then, as computers are only used by large companies, not for everyday people. Steve was amazed and knew that personal computers are what people need, and it would be a revolutionary product of the decade. Steve convinced Woz that the product should be demonstrated to potential investors. While they are on the way to the Homebrew Computer Club, they were discussing the name of the product. Apple Computers, a name that is simple and a fruit that everyone wants. The demonstration was a failure. People at that time did not see the potential in a personal computer. Fortunately, a guy named Paul Terrell took an interest in what Woz had built and was willing to give Steve his name card. The next day, Steve drove to Paul's shop to visit him. Steve managed to close his first deal of 100 units of the first-generation Apple computers and also to be delivered in 60 days. Steve asks his stepdad for permission to use his garage as his first workshop. While Woz was working on the computer, Steve was not happy with the layout of the circuit board of the computer. Woz pointed out that the 60 days deadline promised by Steve was too tight, and he cannot have it both ways. Steve then recruited his friends and neighbors to help out to increase productivity. After 60 days of hard work, the team managed to hand-deliver the product. However, Paul was not satisfied, as he realized Steve and his team only build the circuit boards of a computer. It is useless without a monitor, keyboard, and mouse to make it a workable computer. Steve managed to convince Paul that their product is unique and is what the public needed. People will not only buy the Apple circuit board, but also push the sale of Paul's business by buying the remaining parts to build a complete computer. Paul was a bit reluctant, but in the end, he had no choice but to agree. Steve then also saw an opportunity. He hires an engineer to redesign a computer case where the circuit board can be placed. Steve also demanded the impossible at that time. He wants the cooling fan to be silent as he finds it irritated. Steve, at the same time, went through phone calls after phone calls to pitch their revolutionary product to seek for investors, but all efforts were in vain. After Steve went outburst out of frustration, a car suddenly parked right outside Steve's house. A guy named Mike Markkula stepped out of the car and introduced himself to Steve, as he had heard his computer and had interest. Steve invited Mike into his house to further discuss business. Mike shows interest in what Steve and his team are doing and is willing to put money where his mouth is. Mike offered to invest $90,000 as an angel investor. Steve then counters his offer by offering him $90,000 of investment with $300,000 valuation, and also demands for a $250,000 credit line to be repaid at a 10% interest once the business hits net revenue positive. Mike was impressed with the confidence of Steve and agreed to the deal. It was the year 1977, after Steve had incorporated the company. It is time to show the world about Apple computers. It was the first West Coast computer fair. There were a lot of people exhibiting their inventions and technology. There are thousands of people at the venue. As people gather at Apple's exhibition booth, Steve starts to introduce the company's vision. As people are gaining interest, Steve introduced the Apple II. People are amazed with the Apple II, and it became the first huge success for the company. It was soon the year 1980, with the success of the Apple II computer. Apple was soon expanded and has its own headquarters. Steve is having a meeting with the team that is building Project Lisa. He is not too satisfied with the progress of the project. Steve shares his vision of Lisa to the team. He expects Lisa to be the next big thing of Apple, setting the benchmark of computer experience to people. To stay at the top of the industry, Lisa must outperform the competitors no matter what it takes. When one of the programmers was asked about the function of letter fonts for the system, he gave Steve excuses about the challenges they face and was unwilling to cooperate. Steve fires the programmer on the spot just because he thinks that Apple has no place for a programmer that does not believe in the vision of Apple. Most of the other employees were shocked by Steve's outburst. This shows that Steve is a person hard to work with, and most people do not see eye to eye with him. It was late at night. Steve was still burning the midnight oil in his offices. Woz walks in with disappointment on his face. He heard what happened recently with the Lisa project. Not only that, Woz also expressed that he is unhappy with the changes in the company for what he stood for when building the company. Steve just gave a response that it is part of growing up. It was Apple Incorporated's IPO. Apple was all over the news. The public responded very positively and even set one of the highest growth on Wall Street. Everyone was on their feet, proud to be part of such a massive success company as Steve walks in. It's the year 1982. After the success of going public through IPO, Apple has established a board of directors for further advancement of the company. Arthur Rock was the chairman for the board of directors of that time. Arthur Rock held a meeting with the board, including with Mike, Steve's first investor. Arthur is unsatisfied with the Lisa project because of Steve's over-perfection habit. He pointed out that Steve's perfection is impossible and is causing the company to lose a lot of money before the product is even ready. Mike pointed out that Steve had always been achieving the impossible, that the board should have faith in Steve. Arthur expressed that the company needs to also look at the perspective of the shareholders. He wants Steve to be removed from the Lisa project. Steve was naturally frustrated and cannot accept that he had been pulled out from his own project. Mike then tells Steve that he found an ongoing project that he may be interested in. Steve then walks into the Macintosh team. He saw a few familiar faces there. The team showed Steve their progress on the project. The head of the project walked in, displaying an unwelcoming vibe to Steve. After some dispute between Steve and the head of the project, the head chose to leave. Steve then went around the company, recruiting new members that are the best of the best for the Macintosh. Without any doubt, he also invites Woz for the project. Steve tried a different approach towards the Macintosh. This time, he inspired and gave a clearer vision to his team about what he wants in the computer. Steve also motivated the team and guided the team about why he wants it this way so that the whole team are on the same page as him. After some time, the Macintosh is finally ready. Steve was very satisfied with the end product and cannot wipe off the smile on his face. Steve then brings in John Sculley, the marketing genius from Pepsi, as the CEO of Apple in 1983. He convinced John to come aboard by simply asking him, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or come with me and change the world?" John was convinced and came aboard. Everyone in the office was happy and welcoming John as the CEO of Apple. Even though with John came aboard to Apple, the Macintosh did not achieve even half of the goal. It had only reached a quarter of the goal. Not only that, Apple has hit its first ever quarterly loss since the company began. Steve put the blame on John and also the board for pricing the Macintosh more expensive than what he wanted. From the board's perspective, this is due to Steve's ridiculous quality standards for the product, so they had to mark up the price in order to remain profitable. The two parties then remain in an impasse situation, as Steve wants the best quality of products and the board wants to remain profitable due to the high costs. Everything became downhill for Steve. Woz finally parted ways with Steve as he left the company. The board was having a meeting without Steve as they are planning to kick Steve out of his own company. Steve finds out about the meeting, and John expresses that Steve's perfectionist is his own biggest enemy and the company's. He pointed out that Steve is the reason he cannot do his job as the CEO. The motion of kicking Steve out was then put in a vote. Unfortunately, even Steve's first investor, Mike, voted him out. Steve went through a breakdown and was devastated as the company he built from the ground for almost a decade disposed of him just like that. Over a decade, it was the year 1996, Apple continues to disappoint the public, leading the company to a downfall. Hence, Chairman Arthur Rock and John Sculley had stepped down as the board of Apple. The new Apple CEO, Gil Amelio, is tasked with reviving the company by bringing in Steve as a consultant for Apple. To bring in Steve as a consultant, Apple acquired Next Inc., a company founded by Steve after he was forced out from Apple in the year 1985. The acquisition was about $427 million. The public took the return of Steve very positively. The stock price slowly recovered. Not only that, Apple has slowly got back on its feet with Steve's advisory role. Gil Amelio, slowly realizing Steve is becoming a threat to his CEO position, he then proposes a motion to relieve Steve off his duty. Steve, after learning his lesson, knew how to protect himself from getting disposed of. The motion was unsuccessful, and Steve was even named the CEO of Apple. Not only that, not sure if it was for personal reasons, Steve also soon deposed Mike as the board of directors in the ending of the movie.